Well, she sneaks around the world, from India to Carolina. Sticky fingered footsteps from Berlin down to Belize. Take you for a ride on a slow boat to China. Tell me where in the world is
Carmen Sandiego?
Steal their soul and talk.
This is Lynn Dixon speaking for Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. See you next time. This program was bankrolled by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you.
This program was brought to you by Toyota.
This is PBS.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television. Tonight, begin a new season of The Victory Garden. Enter the hidden world of insects and join Phil Donahue for a look at our healthcare system.
Insects. They are the little things that run the world. 1 million species are known to science. 1 billion are alive at any one time. Learn how scientists are beginning to understand flight, survival strategies, chemical defenses, and the intricate organization of the sisterhood of bees. Join me for Insects, the Ruling Class.
This evening at 7, following The Victory Garden.
Hello, this is Bill Riley. Festival 92 is history. A great one it was. Viewers called in record numbers, and everyone at IPTV is very appreciative. Those pledges that you made to Friends of Iowa Public Television will help quality programming continue for another year. Please fulfill your pledge as soon as possible so the money can be put to work.
There is a growing crisis in the American healthcare system. Is the condition critical? Host Phil Donahue and healthcare experts explore the issues on the American Healthcare Forum. They'll also look at the candidate solutions. Do they offer any hope? It's one of the most serious issues facing Americans today, and it could be the political issue of the election.
See it this evening at 8, following The Infinite Voyage.
Stay tuned for more TV worth watching right here on Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour.
Good evening. I'm Jim Lehrer in Washington.
And I'm Robert MacNeil in New York. After the news summary, Arthur Ashe on the risk of AIDS from old transfusions. Then we examine where the Democratic presidential race stands after yesterday's primaries. 3 other analysts join Gergen and Shields. And we look at tomorrow's general election in Britain, which offers a referendum on the Thatcher legacy and a revival of Scottish nationalism.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
Arthur Ashe has AIDS. The 48-year-old former tennis star announced that fact this afternoon at a news conference in New York City. He said it came from blood transfusions after his second heart bypass operation in 1983. His first was in 1979. A heart attack a few months before had ended his tennis career. Ashe said he'd learned he had the HIV virus after a brain operation in 1988. He said he had not planned to go public, but was forced to when rumors were passed to members of the press. We'll have excerpts from his news conference and more on the story right after the news summary. Robin?
Democratic presidential hopeful Bill Clinton took his campaign to Illinois today, a day after scoring a decisive win in the New York primary. The final result showed Clinton with 41%, Paul Tsongas, who suspended his campaign last month, with 29%, and Jerry Brown, 26%. Clinton was also the winner of contests in Kansas and Wisconsin. At last night's celebration in New York, he said the victories were a turning point in the campaign. Jerry Brown vowed to keep fighting all the way to the convention in spite of yesterday's results. Paul Tsongas is considering whether to re-enter the race. He has scheduled an announcement for tomorrow. President Bush scored big victories in all 3 Republican primaries. Today, he and Mrs. Bush took a pre-dawn stroll beneath Washington's flowering cherry trees. Speaking to reporters who tagged along, he called his showing outstanding. We'll have much more on the presidential race later in the program.
How are you? The travels of Secretary of State Baker and John Sununu were the subject of a government report today. Congress's General Accounting Office said the 2 officials took $774,000 worth of personal and political travel on government planes in one 26-month period. The GAO said Baker, under established formulas, reimbursed the government for $17,000 of the $413,000 his trips cost. Sununu, then White House Chief of Staff, paid $44,500 for his $361,000 worth of travel. Baker announced last week he would begin taking commercial flights for personal travel after learning of the audit.
PLO Chief Yasser Arafat was found alive today after his plane crash-landed in the Libyan desert. It went down last night during a flight from Sudan. 3 crew members reportedly died in the crash. After the plane was reported missing, former President Jimmy Carter called the White House at the request of the PLO. He asked whether the U.S. could use its satellites to help spot the aircraft. U.S. officials said Arafat was found before they could respond. Robert Moore of Independent Television News has the story.
For a man who is constantly traveling and constantly at risk from assassination, Arafat's trip from Sudan to Tunisia must have seemed like just another journey. In fact, it saw his closest brush with death, Yasser Arafat surviving a crash that killed all the crew. Had he died, as was feared for many hours, the Palestinian movement would have lost its best-known spokesman, a national hero without a country, a guerrilla leader now pursuing regional peace talks for the millions of dispossessed Palestinian refugees. Huge relief among his supporters greeted news that this great survivor of politics had again cheated death. There were celebrations across the region, nowhere more so than in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, land that Arafat sees as the territory of a future Palestinian state.
Arafat was seen tonight on Libyan television lying in a hospital bed in the capital, Tripoli. U.S. officials today said Iraq has moved anti-aircraft missiles into the northern security zone for the Kurds. The missile batteries are reportedly above the 36th parallel in violation of UN resolutions. They could pose a threat to Western warplanes protecting the Kurdish region. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft called the deployments a matter of considerable concern. He told CNN that the U.S. was consulting its allies on an appropriate response, but refused to say whether military force was being discussed.
Jurors in the Manuel Noriega trial declared themselves deadlocked today. The jury foreman in Miami wrote a note blaming the impasse on one holdout. He told the judge, "We feel we are wasting time. What should we do?" The judge ordered them to continue deliberating. The jury got the case 4 days ago after a 6-month trial. They are considering 10 drug and racketeering charges against the former leader of Panama.
France announced today that it will suspend its nuclear testing program for the rest of this year. The new Prime Minister, Pierre Bérégovoy, said France hoped the action would encourage other nuclear powers to negotiate further accords on disarmament and testing. France has conducted more than 200 nuclear tests in the South Pacific since 1966. The U.S. said today it was committed to negotiations on testing, but it would continue to conduct its own nuclear tests when needed, despite the French decision. That's our summary of the news. Just ahead, Arthur Ashe's AIDS announcement, the Democratic presidential race, and tomorrow's British election. We lead tonight with the announcement by tennis star Arthur Ashe that he has AIDS. Ashe, who is 48, said he was infected through a blood transfusion during open-heart surgery. He suffered a heart attack in 1979 and had bypass surgery that year and again in 1983. Here is an extended excerpt from his press conference today in New York. He was joined by his wife, Jean, and New York's Mayor, David Dinkins.
Beginning with my admittance to New York Hospital for brain surgery in September 1988, some of you heard that I had tested positive for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. That is indeed the case. It was transmitted through a blood transfusion after one of my open heart bypass operations. In all likelihood, the second operation in 1983. I have known since the time of my brain operation in September 1988 that I have AIDS. I found out when my right hand had lost all motor function and a biopsy of brain tissue removed detected the presence of toxoplasmosis, a marker for AIDS, which is relatively harmless in people with normally functioning immune systems. Subsequent blood tests proved positive for HIV. So, some people may ask, why not go public earlier? The answer to me and my family was simple. Any admission of HIV infection at that time would have seriously, permanently, and my wife and I firmly believe, unnecessarily infringed upon our family's right to privacy. The camera already knows just read the paragraph for me.
Camera already knows that perfect strangers come up to Daddy on the street and say hi. Even though we've begun preparing camera for this news, beginning tonight, Arthur and I must teach her how to react to new, different, and sometimes cruel comments that have very little to do with her reality.
Particularly for the sake of our family, Jeannie and I and some close friends have often talked about how long we could conceal this secret. Then sometime last week, someone phoned USA Today and told the paper. After several days of checking it out, USA Today decided to confront me with the rumors. It put me in the unenviable position of having to lie if I wanted to protect our privacy. No one should have to make that choice. I am sorry that I have been forced to make this revelation now at this time. After all, I am not running for some office of public trust, nor do I have stockholders to account to. It is only that I fall under the dubious umbrella of, quote, public figure, end of quote. I am not sick, and I can function very well in all that I have been involved in for the past several years. As for my family, my wife and daughter are in excellent health, and both are HIV negative.
What lifestyle or emotional factors do you attribute your extraordinary good health to over these 4 years?
Having been an athlete, I had the self-discipline to listen to reality and adjust very quickly to a new regimen. You obviously had to monitor and moderate the stress in your life. Stress impairs the immune system a little bit. I was very fortunate to be able to tolerate AZT. Some HIV-positive patients cannot take it at all. They get very sick when first taking it. Of extreme importance, especially when I've seen others, is the support of my family and friends. I would say that's probably number one.
The announcement by ASHE raised questions about the possibility of infections from past blood transfusions. Some 4,770 AIDS cases in the United States have been attributed to blood transfusions. All but 20 of those cases occurred before 1985, when routine screening of the blood supply for the AIDS virus began. We're joined now by Dr. Ronald SACHER, the Director of Transfusion Medicine at the Georgetown University Medical Center. He's also a spokesman for the American Association of Blood Banks. Dr. SACHER, many people might be asking themselves this evening, if Arthur Ashe got HIV from a transfusion at that time, does it mean other people who had transfusions then face the same risk?
Well, there's certainly a possibility that those individuals who got blood transfusion in the time before blood was screened face the risk of transfusion-transmitted AIDS. And I believe that individuals who received transfusions prior to 1985, when the test was introduced, should actually be tested.
Well, now let's make it clear. How far back before 1985? If they had transfusions back to what year? When did HIV enter the blood supply system?
As far as we can tell, we believe that AIDS entered the blood supply in 1976. That would probably be the earliest time, and this is based on a number of samples of blood that was stored for other tests that have subsequently been tested. So I would say probably 1976 at the earliest.
So are you saying that people who had transfusions between 1976 and 1985 should go and be tested for HIV?
Yes, I believe so. I think that tremendous strides have been made both in the management of individuals who are HIV positive. As Mr. Ashe said, the drug AZT has certainly improved the symptoms that AIDS patients may have. And I think that their life expectancy is increasing. Tremendous strides have been made.
If people followed your advice and turned out to have, to be positive for HIV, how can you tell, or how could they tell, it came from a transfusion?
Well, obviously there are risk factors that would be excluded. The risk factors such as homosexuality and even heterosexual transmission, intravenous drug abuse, and that sort of thing would have to be excluded. But more often than not, the individuals that have been identified as having received a transfusion. If one looks back at that individual's transfusion history, and certainly blood banks keep incredible records, one would be able to trace the donors in many instances and look at their tests, subsequently recall them and look at and maybe ask them specific questions as well.
Wouldn't most people who had got the HIV infection as long ago as that know it by now?
In most cases, yes, and in fact, as Mr. Ashe indicated, he obviously has known it for 6 years. That is true. I think it would be very remote that they wouldn't know it.
So we're talking about very few people then, are we, who might have had transfusions in that period and got the HIV infection but not know about it?
That is correct.
So a person who hadn't got the HIV infection or hadn't turned up some symptoms by this time is statistically probably in the clear. Would that also be true?
Statistically, that's true, but we still do get to see some individuals who may appear to be HIV positive and have a risk factor of a transfusion at that time. It still occurs. I think it must vary according to factors of the recipient and their overall health status as well.
Mm-hmm. That means that it's possible that somebody could have got the infection then, but still be quite healthy because he was in such very good health or his own immune system was so strong or something like that?
Well, presumably it must relate to health factors of that individual, as well as potentially the virulence of the virus. There may be different strains of this particular virus that we just don't recognize. But you're absolutely correct. I would say that the probability would be extremely remote.
What was the chance of getting HIV from a transfusion then? What was the risk factor, and what is it now that the blood supply is so well screened?
Well, let me start by saying that the blood supply is the safest it's ever been at the moment, and let me start by also adding that in the last 2 weeks we've gotten some statistics that the risk is probably less than 1 in 225,000. It's very likely less than that, but that seems to be the most accurate figure for the present time. What the risk was then, of course, there were a number of figures that were touted. Very likely it was close to probably 1 in 10,000 and maybe more than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Sacher, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, Democrats versus Democrats in America, Tories versus Labor in Britain. The latest episode in the saga of Bill Clinton is next tonight. He hits, he misses, he gets hit, he loses, he's counted out, he's counted in, he's the front runner, he's had it, and so it has gone Tuesday after most Tuesdays, primaries after primaries, since it all began in New Hampshire 2 months ago. Yesterday, he won a big one in New York, as well as in Kansas and Wisconsin. Jerry Brown, his last still standing opponent for the Democratic presidential nomination, came in third in New York, not only behind Clinton, but also behind Paul Tsongas, who quit campaigning 3 weeks ago. So, the question tonight is again the ever familiar, where does this latest round of results leave Bill Clinton now? We ask it and others of our regular political analyst GERGEN and Shields, U.S. News and World Report Editor-at-Large David GERGEN, and syndicated columnist Mark Shields, and of Republican pollster Linda DIVALL, Democratic pollster Peter Hart, and Eddie Williams, president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Mark, let's start with you. You are in Miami tonight. Where does Bill Clinton stand tonight as it looks to you?
Well, Bill Clinton, Jim, is in that time of the political nominating season where there are no more moral victories, there are no more better than expected. Winning is defined by coming in first, something he did yesterday, as you pointed out, in 3 different states. And for that reason, he has a large leg up tonight and a lot closer to the nomination. He's at the very least the front walker for the Democratic nomination at this point. The only question really remains, because Jerry Brown took a real pasting yesterday in New York, is Bill Clinton himself.
Yeah. Front walker, was that the term you would use, David?
I'm sure it's not the term Bill Clinton would use. No. I think Bill Clinton's back in the driver's seat, Jim. You know, Jerry Brown got his hand on the wheel here in Connecticut, and it slipped off in New York. And I think that Bill Clinton, you have to say, he was the first Southerner who's ever won that New York primary. Jimmy Carter got beat a couple times there. It's been a very hard state for a Southerner to win. Al Gore had a hard time last time. Bill Clinton's in much better shape tonight. He's back in the driver's seat. It's going to be very hard to stop him for the nomination.
You agree, Eddie? Very hard to stop him, that he's going to get that nomination. Odds are.
I think it's hard to stop him. He can stop himself. I think we learned a lot of things in New York in terms of how he appeals to different constituencies under pressure. In fact, I think the whole electorate is happy to get New York out of the way, and we can all now begin to look at perhaps some more saner politics.
Yeah. Peter, Mark said that okay, he won. But he's still got problems. You agree?
Sure, he has problems, but give him credit, first of all,
okay,
because he really did a heck of a job in New York. A week ago, we would have said he would be lucky to be standing, and he won a double-digit victory, so give him credit to start with. Now, having said that, there are character questions that remain. He's going to have to deal with that. I mean, I would tell him, first of all, go home, take some time off. The voters need a rest. You need a rest. You need a fresh voice, and the press needs a rest as much as anything. Second thing, he needs to be able to come back, and he needs to be able to set priorities and start to deal with some of the uncertainties that voters have. And that means understanding that you have to deal frankly and openly with what's there. And the voters need to see more of Bill Clinton than they've seen right now. He does certain things extremely well. And when he's open and he brings and includes people, he's great. When he's a confrontationalist, I think he loses people. And the third thing I tell him is forget about Jerry Brown. Okay, you've taken on Jerry Brown, you've taken him apart one way or another. Now you have to tell voters about yourself, what you stand for, what you believe in. Voters know more about Bill Clinton's 20s than about his 40s. And that's a scary sign going into the general election.
Linda, is there joy in Republicanville tonight over the fact that Bill Clinton won as well as he did and is still the front runner?
Well, I'm trying not to smile too much, but I think in this environment, it would be a major mistake to be too confident about an election that's still 6 months away. But I think there are a couple problems that Clinton faces. One, he did terrible with his own generation. I mean, baby boomers only gave him 1 out of 3 votes, and I think there's still some skepticism that his peers have of him. Secondly, when you look at who you vote for in November, 31% of the Democrat primary voters in New York said that they were going to vote for George Bush or Ross Perot. And third, when you ask people, does he have the honesty and integrity to be president, 46% say no. So those are 3 fundamental problems that he has to address, and I think Peter made a very good point that if Clinton can get to sort of the general election message, not get entangled with Jerry Brown, he is much better served. His speech last night in that regard was terrific, but he's not quite at the point of being able to do that just yet. He can't just brush aside Brown totally yet, and we also have to look at what Tsongas might do.
Mark, what does he do about Jerry Brown now? Or what does Jerry Brown do about Bill Clinton now? Or frame the question any way you would like.
Well, Jim, I think Jerry Brown had happened to him almost identically what happened to Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan got close to 2 out of 5 votes in a protest in New Hampshire, at which point he got greater press and public scrutiny and was found wanting, that there wasn't a complete package there wasn't a whole program, there wasn't that his other values were open to question. The same thing happened with Jerry Brown, quite frankly. Jerry Brown's candidacy was a protest vehicle, but it won in Connecticut. Once it won, they said, well, let's look at this guy as a potential leader. He was found wanting. His ideas were rejected. The 13% scared older voters into the Clinton column for fear that Social Security would somehow be threatened. Beyond that, Jerry Brown's candidacy was a protest.
The flat tax idea.
The flat tax, his 13% flat tax. And beyond that, Jim, Jerry Brown's candidacy lacked and continues to lack any sense of joy, of optimism, of a real vision about the future. It's a syllabus of errors about the present, and it strikes a resonant chord with a lot of voters, but there isn't a sense of where he wants to take the nation in a more uplifting way.
Eddie Williams, where does Jerry Brown take himself right now? What should he do?
Well, I think he's going to go all the way to the convention. But I have a feeling, though, that he plays a bit of a straight man for Clinton. I mean, Clinton needs someone to react to. Brown continues to help bring out some parts of that personality or bring out character issues that Clinton has to deal with. I don't see Brown dropping out. I think he's going to stay in.
David, but if Brown does stay in, and if he continues to do what he's done up to this point, which is just hammer Clinton every chance he gets, even though Clinton beat him at his own game, more or less, with some help from Brown himself, I mean, that's going to continue to take a toll on Clinton, is it not?
Not if Bill Clinton follows Peter Hart's advice. I think it's the right advice. Pat Buchanan kept on hammering George Bush, but when George Bush started ignoring Pat Buchanan was no longer in the headlines, and that's what Bill Clinton needs to do to Jerry Brown right now. To come back and to expand on the point with Peter, and this may seem a far-fetched analogy, but I worked for Richard Nixon some years ago, and we always were aware that there were 2 sides to that personality. There was a bright side of man that wanted to be a great president, and then there was this darker side. And when the dark side got in his way, and I would argue that with Bill Clinton, there is this very bright side, and yet there's a darker side that seems evasive or devious that bothers people a lot, and he somehow has to, if he can show his brighter side, as Peter's saying, be more open, learn to answer questions candidly and fully instead of dodging around and creating all these doubts in people's minds, he will be a stronger candidate. His speech, to go back to what somebody Linda said, I think his speech last night was one of the best moments in his campaign. It was a healing speech. It was a unifying speech. If he moves to those themes and moves away from this contact sport with Jerry Brown, I think he'd be much better served and a stronger candidate.
Linda, the polls aside, what is your own analysis of what Bill Clinton's problem is and how he could combat it from this point on?
Well, I think first and foremost his problem is, and David alluded to it, that every time he gets caught in a problem or a scandal or an explanation, it's not just one explanation. We seem to have 2 or 3 explanations. And it's much like when you're growing up, your parents say, well, tell me the truth the first time around, you'll be better off for it. And I think this campaign has sort of proven that advice is still valid.
Well, how do you cure that in a person?
Going back to what David just said, I mean, you have to be forthcoming, you have to be candid. And again, I think he is a product of his generation, but I think, baby boomers particularly, and hopefully our parents, will understand that some mistakes were made along the way. Face up to it immediately, explain yourself. the night after the Illinois primary, he did do a speech of repentance, if you will, and that plus the change message that he had going quite aggressively there. If he gets back to that, he can do himself a lot of good. The other problem he has in terms of advice is that he and Hillary have to sit down and they have to think through the fact that they are new models in American politics in terms of two people seeking the presidency of their generation, and exactly what are each of them going to do and say, because she is creating problems for him. She's a very strong person. I think she has offended a certain segment of the female voter. I think that her comments in the Vanity article last week were unnecessary at this level of American politics and unsubstantiated. And I think that tendency to say too much.
To the possibility that that President Bush might have had an affair.
Right. I don't think that is becoming a spouse's, a candidate's spouse in terms of what people want to see and hear on the campaign trail. She's a very strong personality. They have to sit down and figure out exactly how they're going to play that as they go through between now and New York during the convention.
That makes sense to you, Peter?
I think yes. I think it still comes back around to Bill Clinton. I think Bill Clinton's going to have a second chance and a third chance. And I pick up on what David said. Bill Clinton can be as good as they come. And last night we saw the potentiality. And here we are, we're focusing all on Bill Clinton, and there's sort of the presumption that everything's okay with George Bush. George Bush has the same problems that he had going into the primaries. He hasn't solved those. He's going to have to deal with those. So the sense is Bush is okay. The answer is both of them are going to be tested. Let me make one other point, and that is candidates always look better at the beginning of the process than in the middle. Ronald Reagan started out 2.5 to 1 positive going into 1980, as David Gergen remembers. And by the time he ended up in June, he was only about 4 to 3 positive. So that voters, Republican voters, lost sort of their positive feelings. But in the end, obviously, he came out very well.
Mark, what about Paul Tsongas? He's going to make an announcement tomorrow. If you were a betting man, and I know you're not, how would you bet? Is he going to get back in, and does that make sense?
Well, I would hope that he doesn't get back in, because I think that Paul Tsongas loses a little bit of his differentness. Paul Tsongas, first of all, did better in New York than he had done in either Michigan or Illinois, where he campaigned. And quite frankly, Bill Clinton could be accused of being a regional candidate. Paul Tsongas' strength has been in a certain style and type of electorate. The Democratic electorate, and the Connecticut's, the Massachusetts, New Hampshire. He is not going into friendly territory at this point. And I think the fact that he, in Pennsylvania and Ohio and the upcoming industrial states, and I really think, Jim, that Paul Tsongas understands that. I think he grasps that he did better in New York, where, again, his ideas weren't being scrutinized and his positions weren't being criticized by an aggressive Bill Clinton.
How do you feel about that, Eddie?
Well, I would advise him not to get back in. I'm sure he will not be deceived by the size of the vote in terms of it's all being very pro-Paul Tsongas. He was being used as a vessel of dissent and of protest.
People didn't like either Clinton or
Brown. They were using the available line. And after all, he still...
Do the exit polls reflect that? For the most part?
Yes, half of all people who voted for Tsongas said it was because they disliked the other two candidates. So we know that.
And after all, he still is the same person he was at the time he got out. And of course, he was defeated in the Southern primary in Illinois and Michigan. So I think in my view, he really looks and sounds more ministerial than presidential, and he'd make an excellent cabinet member.
Could he blow the whole deal by getting back in? In other words, he went out with such style, and in fact, you and Mark said on this show that he was a loser, but in a way he was a winner. He came out of this in good shape. If he goes back in tomorrow, does he risk blowing the whole deal?
He does, and just as I felt by his getting out, he was going to hurt Bill Clinton. I think by getting back in, he'll help Bill Clinton, because I think Clinton will go on and whomp him in Pennsylvania, and he'll beat Jerry Brown as well, and then Clinton will come out looking like a bigger winner when it's over.
Linda, David Broder had a column in the Washington Post this morning saying that maybe it's time for the leaders of the Democratic Party to get together and decide whether or not Clinton can beat George Bush in November and maybe exert a little more control over the process. But what was your reaction when you read that?
Well, with all respect to David Broder, whose opinion I normally think a lot of. I think, speaking as a Republican strategist, it would be great if the Democrat Party would do that. If they got behind closed doors and we had 5 guys picking a new nominee, as opposed to Bill Clinton, who's been struggling and going after it for a year, you couldn't write a better scenario for a Republican success story. I just think the environment is just not at all conducive towards that type of strategy.
Peter?
Bill Clinton's earned it, and unless somebody can beat him, he's going to be the Democratic nominee. The more important point that David brought up is the fact that the voters do not feel included in the process. We had a huge fall off in New York because they weren't discussing the issues. And one of the challenges to Bill Clinton is to bring in voters, because if we have 500,000 less voters in New York than we did 4 years ago, it just means that somehow we're not inspiring people. And if Democrats are going to win in 1992, it means getting people out, and that's where Bill Clinton has to be at his best.
Mark, do you agree then that that what you see is what you're going to get if you're a Democrat? That anybody who's sitting out there thinking that 5 people in a room, to use Linda's analogy, are going to say, "Oh, wait a minute, this isn't quite working, and we got a better one," and trot him out? That's not going to happen.
I don't think it's going to happen, Jim, unless there's a major disaster in the Clinton candidacy. But let me just say one thing about Bill Clinton, and that is, I differ slightly. I think Bill Clinton has to change the subject from his own personal peccadilloes background to really how he would be different as a president. He has to excite people. He has to get people a sense of...
In other words, does he have to start running against George Bush now?
Yes, and give a sense of what government can do, how he wants to be a leader, how a Clinton presidency would be different. It has to be that rather than this... because, Jim, if your child is sick with a ruptured appendix, you're really not worried whether that surgeon you're hiring paid his 1040 form or filled it out at IRS. You want a good surgeon. And this country is in trouble. There's pessimism. There's a sense of disillusionment. And that's what Bill Clinton has to address.
David?
Well, I wanted to go back to your other question, but Peter, I think, wanted to respond to
Peter, you were shaking your head. All the time you were talking, Mark, Peter was shaking his head.
What?
Let me just say, I always bet with Mark, but in this case, I'll differ just slightly by saying that, look, for Bill Clinton, he's going to have plenty of time to go after George Bush, worry about himself. It's the next 6 weeks he has the best chance to define himself, and I'm worried that he's going to do what he does best, which is go after the other candidate, and I don't think it necessarily enhances him. I think he needs to be able to define himself.
And David, you said last night that this issue that remains for Clinton, which all the polls indicated in New York and the other states, is the honesty and trust one. You still believe he has to deal with that directly, do you not?
Absolutely. It is a threshold question. Unless you pass that threshold, you don't get considered seriously on the other issues, because people want to know who that person is in that office. They want to feel they can trust and respect that person in that office. And unless you get past that barrier, I don't think that's the price of admission to the game. And I don't think he's passed that for a lot of people. But I'd like to come back to your original question, if I could, if we could retrace this. I'm sorry. The question of, this was said with regard to Bill Clinton, whom I do think is probably going to be the nominee, unless, as Mark says, some disaster happens. Jim, I think that the leadership of the party, the Democratic Party, has abandoned its responsibility for peer review of the candidates in this process. They essentially have said, let's turn it all over to the voters. We're not going to pay any attention, not going to help the voters figure out who is good, who has the experience, whom we respect within our own party. And I frankly think that has produced a series of candidates for the Democratic Party that have been shown by experience not to be able to win. And it is not right for any profession to lack peer review, and that's what's going on in our politics now. This system is wide open to anybody who come in from the outside. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows who they are when they come in the door. Then the leadership turns over to the press and says, you guys in the press, and women in the press, you scrutinize them for the voters. And now we have the press going around looking under every rock or every speck of dirt that we can. There ought to be some say on the part of the party. After all, the nominee represents the party. Mm-hmm. And the party is supposed to come forward with somebody to represent. I don't think the process is working very well for the Democratic Party.
But David, didn't Bill Clinton have a tremendous number of endorsements from Democratic office holders?
He had the most, but they were mostly state office holders. I would say that prior to the New Hampshire primary, it would have been helpful if the party not only had some screening process, but also helped to push forward the leading members of the party. One of the reasons that Bill Clinton is having so much trouble and this has been such a crazy process is, of course, that a lot of the heavy hitters in the Democratic Party never got in the primary.
Linda, And Eddie, Peter was on the show last night, and he said that one of the problems that Clinton has is that, and that he thinks also George Bush has, is that they haven't figured out yet that it's 1992 and it's not 1988, and that the different rules apply, and the rules this time are tell the truth. When in doubt, tell the truth. And the normal way of running for office is by the boards. Do you agree with Peter Hart?
Yes, I do. I thought it was interesting what President Bush said this morning in his early morning walk. This election is not about the past 3 years' experience. It's about who is going to produce the change that this country needs. And I think the president, by saying that, does clearly understand that people are demanding, not that I've gotten the message, they want to know what it is that you're going to do and where it is that you're going to take the country. I think with Bill Clinton, he's got a twofold problem. First, I agree with David totally. He has got to address this character issue first, because voting for the presidency, that issue is probably more important than it is for any other office that we vote for in this country. And until he gets beyond that, when you still have 1 out of 2 people questioning his character, he can't get on to the next part of the equation. But he does have 6 weeks now, I agree, to address that, and then to look at where it is that he would take the country.
Very quickly, Eddie, do you agree with that?
Well, the character question is very important, but he also has some real strengths in terms of people believing that he can win, and that's very important to Democrats. He's very bright and he's very quick, and one thing he has to do is to learn to think through an answer to a question. When he commits himself to having done more for civil rights than anybody else in America, I mean, I think that is really ridiculous.
Okay, I got you. Linda, gentlemen, thank you very much.
We focus now on tomorrow's elections in Britain for a new parliament and possibly a new prime minister. The latest polls show almost a dead heat between the ruling Conservative Party of Prime Minister John Major and the Labour opposition of Neil Kinnock. A third party, the Liberal Democrats, could win enough seats in the House of Commons to hold the balance of power and possibly help form a coalition government. The elections are being followed closely by politicians here because, coincidentally or not, over the past 30 years, there have been strong parallels between U.S. and U.K. results. In 1964, British Labour and American Democrats won. In 1979, the Conservative returned to power under Margaret Thatcher, preceded by a year the victory of Ronald Reagan's Republicans. Our coverage tonight begins with a background report from ELEANOR Goodman, a political reporter for Independent Television News.
The Prime Minister started this week determined to defy the polls, which suggests that only an unprecedented swing to the government in the last few days will save him. Publicly, he remained confident, joking with the photographers.
I'm sorry they're not eggs, lads.
But moments later, his stoicism was tested. An egg hit him on the face, clearly shaking him and his security men. But as before, when confronted by a demonstrator, he tried to turn the incident to his advantage.
Not to worry. That is what we're fighting against, so just fight harder.
The Tories insist that such incidents are totally atypical and that the warmth of his normal reception is far more representative of his standing in the country. Publicly, he continues to insist, despite some unofficial reports to the contrary from constituencies, that the Tories' own canvass returns show their vote holding up much better than the polls suggest. But increasingly, as the campaign has entered its final days, the Tories have been forced to acknowledge the possibility they might lose in an attempt to frighten former Tory voters back into the fold. This morning, the tactic was again to warn of the dangers of a hung parliament.
A Labour government would smash the hopes of recovery and a hung parliament would smother them. I don't know which form of death is the more painful.
When questioned, Mr Major refused to countenance the possibility of anything but outright victory.
I have said repeatedly through this election that I'm confident we're going to have a clear majority on polling day and that we are going to form the government with a majority that will last for 5 years.
Throughout this election, Mr Major has had to fight against the background of the recession. Today, he was supported by a full lineup of ministers who all came prepared with sound bites spelling out how the Tories would bring about recovery. But Mr Major acknowledged that the recession was one reason why the election looked like being so close.
If it were not for the recession, if it had not for the difficulties and the bruises that have been caused by the recession, I don't believe there is any doubt that there would be an increased majority for the Conservative Party at this general election. But recessions hurt people. We understand that.
Nevertheless, the word from the Tory camp was that things were moving their way in the critical final 24 hours, and that it would be Mr Kinnock who would look foolish on Friday morning. The Tories have been hoping all campaign that Mr Kinnock would make a gaffe, but today at a brick factory, at the last of his carefully controlled photo opportunities, he resolutely refused to drop a brick.
All part of building Britain.
And at the press conference, Mr. Kinnock claimed that the campaign had vindicated his original forecast of an outright victory.
There is a very strong acknowledgement, and the closer you get to the individual constituencies, the stronger it becomes. And it certainly comes from people here who have been on the campaign trail and to hundreds of constituencies in the last few weeks, that forecast that I made of majority government has complete authority from the doorstep, which is the best kind of authority.
Despite the narrowing of their lead tonight in some polls, Labour claims that they are getting the swing they need in the critical marginal seats. But much could depend on what happens to Paddy Ashdown's vote. The Liberal Democrats believe that there will be wide regional variations, and that while they may be squeezed in some traditional Tory Labour seats, they will spring surprises elsewhere.
I think both Labour and the Conservatives are counting their chickens before they're hatched. The fact is that people are now moving to the Liberal Democrats very strongly, and I think the people of Britain will probably deny either of them the right to govern this country, and they'll be right to do so.
Tonight, Mr. Ashdown claimed to be as fresh as a daisy, but judging by the way the gap appears to have closed between the two major parties, all the politicians could be in for a very long night tomorrow before they know for certain the outcome of this election.
Now we hear directly from the leaders of the two biggest parties. The one whose party gets the most seats in the House of Commons will become Prime Minister. We start with Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock, who was interviewed Monday by John Snow of the independent television news Channel 4 program. Snow asked Kinnock if his plans to change Britain's government included getting rid of the second parliamentary chamber, the unelected House of Lords.
Certainly the objective of replacing the House of Lords will be pursued. We want an elected chamber, that is basic, and in order to achieve that, we want to ensure that the legislative program is steady, that it's capable of being delivered, that it enjoys widespread assent. I'm certain.
But Labour government have said that before, and absolutely nothing happened.
But none of them have approached it, first of all, with the kind of analysis that we've undertaken over a prolonged period, gaining the kind of consensus that exists, and none of them have done it either quite in the same circumstances as we'll be doing it, proposing that it becomes a genuinely representative second chamber. You see,
you've used this word consensus. You've used it tonight, and you've used it a lot in the last few days, consensus government. Fact is that there's very little prospect of any party getting more than, let's say, 43% of the vote. Mrs. Thatcher had 43% at the last election. You'll be very pleased to have 43%, I would think, this time. That will give you the same mandate, and no greater mandate than she had, for radical reform. Well, now, that is not democracy, is it?
The use of democracy, the use of that mandate is of the essence. See, Mrs. Thatcher, with 43% of the vote, ruled as if she had something near 100% of the vote. She had a very large majority. And instead of taking the advice of Francis Pym and understanding the shortcomings and the temptations of ruling with a degree of absoluteness, then there was a certain ruthlessness in the conduct of government. I think that what we bring to bear, especially with those lessons in mind, is a majority government that uses its power to ensure that there is an invitation, for instance, to the National Economic Assessment, to the Plant Committee, and an attitude in the conduct of power that prevents government from becoming remote or remorseless in the way in which it bulldozes everything before.
Well, if you do get in and find yourself there on Friday, you'll be there because people didn't want the Conservatives anymore and want change. You could face some extremely tough decisions. You could, as you already indicated, find the books are in a worse state than you think they are, and you may have to disappoint very large numbers of people who have very high hopes of you in office. Are you prepared to be brutal, to be tough, to disappoint them?
I think that everybody knows that the sense of responsibility I have means that I will take tough decisions if tough decisions need to be taken. The important thing to do is to ensure that we move from the form of toughness, which was manifested by the last 13 years of Conservative government, which ensured that the weakest in our society, and often the most productive in our society, suffered, whilst those who could have afforded to bear the biggest burden got away from it. And so in the exercise of toughness, there has to be toughness with sensitivity to what the interests of the whole nation are. Now, it's one of the reasons why our propositions for change are prudent, are costed, and are related to getting an investment-led recovery. We will pursue that. And if it requires additional toughness, durability, tenacity in doing that, then I think that I'll demonstrate to the nation that I have those qualities too.
Early today, Prime Minister John Major was interviewed by Jon Snow.
Isn't your difficulty that you've been the Prime Minister for 16 months with the huge advantage of not being Mrs. Thatcher and not being Mr. Heseltine, but you have failed to distance yourself from the policy failures of the Thatcher years?
The Conservative Party has perhaps the most coherent philosophy of any political party in Western Europe. That philosophy was evident through the 1980s, the belief in the free enterprise system, the belief that people should have more direct choice, the lowest possible level of taxation, choice in the way they spend their money. Now that is a consistent theme right the way across the Conservative Party. What I'm seeking to do is to build on the baseline that I've inherited from Mrs. Thatcher. It's a baseline, I believe, that enables us to build a level of prosperity in the 1990s unmatched by anything we've seen in the past. And that's the important thing. What are we going to do in the future, and how are we going to do it? The first thing is to get inflation down, restore confidence, and I think tomorrow's election result will do that. And then we can begin to see the levels of growth I wish to see in this country.
Some people say, well, you know, you haven't really seen a major government. He had to inherit all these things from Mrs. Thatcher and some of the people with the things. If you win, and you've said you want a mandate, and that's why you want to win, if you win, how will the government look any different?
Well, it's a question of how the policies evolve and what we seek for people. I mean, I am absolutely clear and have been through the campaign about the priorities I have. I do want to widen choice. I do want the lowest level of taxation consistent with being able to sustain our public services. I do intend to see the National Health Service remains as it is, the finest national health service in the world, and it continues to grow. I do want us to take our important role within Europe, but not in a federal Europe, not in a United States of Europe, but in a Europe of nation states, and a Europe that extends and grows, bringing in the EFTA states to the north, and eventually spreading the community right the way across Eastern Europe. Now, those are big themes. And perhaps above all, as I have indicated repeatedly before and during this election campaign, I am critically concerned to maintain the unity of the United Kingdom.
Well, those are some of the points you make in this leaflet which was put out today. 10 good reasons to vote Conservative. Keep taxes low, get the basic right in education, be tough on crime, keep strong defences. Yet you don't mention health. 10 points about voting Conservative. What's wrong with your health policy?
I have been mentioning health in speech after speech.
But why not in the 10 reasons for voting Conservative?
Because we have all sorts of other pamphlets dealing with health. That is by no means the only leaflet we put out. If one wants to deal with health policy, I'm happy to deal with it either in the short term or the long term.
But in here are all the points that you've made throughout the campaign, except health.
No, they're not. I've made a vast range of points far beyond that, and we have other leaflets dealing with other points far beyond that. Health, right the way through this campaign, has been one of the central themes. You have heard most of my speeches. No doubt you've read those you haven't heard. I don't believe you could find one in which health wasn't an important ingredient, because I believe in the National Health Service. I'm determined the National Health Service will be built up, and I'm determined the National Health Service will remain a national health service. It's not going to be privatized. Let me make that entirely clear. I am no more likely to privatize it than I am to join the Labour Party.
The Prime Minister mentioned the unity of the United Kingdom. One of the biggest differences between the British parties is how much they should yield to growing demands in Scotland for more self-government or even independence. Scotland was a separate nation until its union with England in 1707. Now Labour and the Liberal Democrats favour local self-government and a Scottish Parliament. The Conservatives oppose even that, while a Scottish nationalist party, the SNP, is pushing for more independence. Anne MacMILLAN of the CBC Journal filed this report on the election in Scotland.
Calling. This is the Scottish National Party calling. Campaigning for re-election and to free Scotland from an English Tory government forever. This is the Scottish National Party calling. This is the Scottish
The SNP was once a fringe party, a bit of a joke. But today it rides a wave of nationalism that's sweeping Scotland. Alex Salmon, party leader, is on the campaign trail in Glasgow, certain of success.
Yeah, you give a chance and we can stop this.
The majority of Scots favour more self-government, but the SNP goes all the way. It promises complete independence.
Things aren't working for the people of Scotland. We can do a lot better than we're currently doing. We're not looking for a parliament as a constitutional abstraction, something for the tourists to come and see. We're looking for a people's parliament, offering power and prosperity to the nation of Scotland.
It's among the youth of Scotland that nationalism is most obviously grabbing hold. At Glasgow's Uskey Bay pub, it's as fashionable to wear a kilt as it is to dress in jeans. This is a return to roots, where culture and politics combine in a demand for change.
People are beginning to think that in order to have a voice, it'll have to be our own voice and we'll have to look after our own affairs.
I think that mainly a lot of the young people are fed up with the policies of the Labour and Conservative Party. Therefore, a lot of Scottish young people are looking towards the SNP party.
It may be a new cause for the young, but Scottish nationalism is as old as the ancient buildings of Edinburgh. In this city, once the seat of Scottish kings, the call for self-government has always been a rallying cry. Ever since Scotland joined up with England in 1707, there have been attempts to reclaim some of its lost powers. This building in Edinburgh was refurbished in the 1970s in the hopes of housing a Scottish assembly. It didn't happen then, but today, more than ever, the dream of Scottish power could come true. The unused debating chamber inside the proposed assembly building bears silent witness to a system of government which the majority of Scots resent. There are 72 Scottish MPs, but their parliament is in London, hundreds of kilometres from here. Most Scots vote for Labour MPs, yet they're ruled by a Conservative government which has become more and more despised.
Get Tory England off Scotland's backward coast. Vote for the Scottish National Party. Vote for Scotland this time. Make it happen. Vote for independence.
We're sick and tired of the contemptuous treatment, government by remote control from south of the border. The imposition of things like the poll tax on the Scottish people was the final straw for many people in Scotland. There's also a very positive current of opinion, and that's what the position of Scotland's going to be in the new Europe.
For many Scots, that new Europe offers a new security. David McCrone, the University of Edinburgh.
As Europe has grown in political and economic importance in Britain and in Scotland, so the Scots see a new future for themselves within the European community, and it doesn't seem such a large step from the present position of being part of Britain within Europe to being entirely our own country, but also within Europe.
Scotland is rich in natural resources. 80% of Europe's oil reserves is under Scottish waters. 1/3 of Europe's fish is landed in Scotland. But whether it could make it as an independent nation is open to question. The Glencast foundry north of Edinburgh is a case in point. It makes everything from drill bits for North Sea oil rigs to fittings for the Channel Tunnel. Business is booming in spite of the recession. But self-rule would be a disaster, according to owner Peter Hughes, forcing many businesses to move south to England.
80% of my business from this particular company is south of the border. They're worried, and I don't want worried customers. Business requires stable economic conditions and stable political conditions, and independence doesn't give us either of these things. I am a fervent Scot. I wear my kilt when I go to Canada, when I go to America, when I go to Europe. But I'm also sensible, and I'm a businessman, and I want what's good for business. Simple as that.
This is the Scottish National Party calling.
Scottish nationalist politicians have a completely different line. They tell voters an independent Scotland will be part of Europe. And in a global economy, location doesn't matter much anyway. This is an election about Scotland's future, about what sort of country tomorrow's voters will inherit. It's a fight to retain traditions, to regain political control. There are several choices. All parties but the Conservatives promise some sort of self-government. And privately, even the Tories say change must come.
Again, the major stories of this Wednesday. Former tennis star Arthur Ashe said he has AIDS. He said he got it from a blood transfusion during a 1983 heart bypass operation. And PLO chief Yasser Arafat was found alive 15 hours after his plane crash-landed in the Libyan desert. These are the first pictures of Arafat since the crash. He is seen with a bandaged right eye being taken off a rescue plane with other survivors, and later in a Libyan hospital with that country's leader, Muammar Gaddafi. The videotape was broadcast on Libyan television. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Jim. That's the NewsHour tonight. We'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the NewsHour is also provided by AT&T and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
This is PBS.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour.
There is a growing crisis in the American healthcare system. Is the condition critical? Host Phil Donahue and healthcare experts explore the issues on the American Healthcare Forum. They'll also look at the candidate solutions. Do they offer any hope? It's one of the most serious issues facing Americans today, and it could be the political issue of the election.
See it this evening at 8, following The Infinite Voyage.
Hello, this is Bill Riley. Festival